I think this is relevant though, because we do have a big NASCAR audience. And is it fair to say, Eric, you're a sports fan? Are you a casual sports fan? You're not a NASCAR fan, correct?
Correct.
Okay. Here's why I ask. NASCAR had this clash out in the LA area where you live for 3 years. Now, they did it. They did it in the football stadium. They switched. They're going to Bowman Gray for this year's clash. Do you remember, did the clash, did it stir up, were people in LA talking about it? Because the reason they did this, and they probably lost money on the infrastructure, but they wanted to get into the second biggest media market and not somewhere on the outskirts, literally in LA. Did that work in your opinion at all? Did it stir up interest? Did you see some billboards and all that? Do you think there's more NASCAR fans in the greater LA area because they brought it directly to you guys?
That's a good question. So it definitely stirred up interest nationally because I heard about it and I saw it. It was probably the biggest event I remember of that NASCAR season in terms of the national publicity I saw surrounding it, other than the Daytona 500. But locally, now again, this is kind of skewed because as we talked about before with social media and everybody on their screens all day, my circle of friends out here is not huge. I'm not a native. I've been here for about 5 years. So I don't know that I'm a fair representation, but based on my experience, no. And the people I come in contact with, I remember hearing zero people talking about NASCAR, how excited they were to go see the race at the Coliseum. I thought it was a really cool idea. I watched it on TV for maybe 10 or 15 minutes, just kind of checked it out because I thought it was cool. But I don't know that it necessarily got a ton of NASCAR fans on board, although it was a really cool idea. I don't know. But part of that isn't necessarily an indictment on NASCAR. Part of that is just LA. LA is not, in terms of its sports affinity, it is not a Northeast or Midwestern city. And there are probably several reasons for that. I think one of them is obvious with the weather. The year-round good weather matters. It matters that people aren't stuck inside to escape snow or rain or the freezing cold for certain parts of the year. That just isn't a thing here. And so also a ton of people here are transplants, so that has something to do with kind of a lack of affinity for teams, certain team sports and loyalty there. So I just think there's just so much going on here. If you brought an event like that to a city that didn't have as many major pro team sports, it probably would have been an even bigger deal. But here in LA, you've got not just one, but two teams in all of the major pro sports leagues, plus USC, plus UCLA. And then you have all the entertainment things that are going on here, concerts and comedy shows. And again, all of the weather, you can surf year round. There's mountains, there's ski resorts right outside LA. There's just so much to do here that I just think breaking through and making something like NASCAR a big deal here, I just don't see it. Although, if you go to rural areas of California, as you said, they have a NASCAR race, about an hour outside of LA that does well.
All right, so my NASCAR follow-up. What would NASCAR have to do to get Eric Messersmith to pay more attention? I'm wondering, if you're flipping through the channels and you see there's 7 laps left in a race, are you going to watch? I mean, if there's 57 laps, I get it, or 100. But if you see there's 5 laps left, are you going to watch the last 5 laps?
That's a good question. You know what's funny is this gets back to another thing with the difference of how we grew up versus now. I really don't flip anymore. I think that is a thing that's kind of lost. I just go to what I want. You know what I mean? So very rarely am I searching for something. I wonder if so it doesn't even come onto my radar. But if it did, and there were only 5 laps left, I'd probably watch it. Remember, I grew up in central Pennsylvania, which is NASCAR country. I mean, people love NASCAR where I grew up in central PA. So I grew up watching to some degree. I was never a huge fan, but my stepdad would have it on. I would watch it. But here's the answer to your question. What would get me interested is personalities. Part of the reason were the feuds you used to have, were the Dale Earnhardts of the world. Even I always liked who was the guy who was from California, who was an all-time great driver, who everybody else hated? I don't know why I'm blanking on his name. Jeff Gordon. I always liked Jeff Gordon because everybody else hated him. And I thought it was cool. Like, here's this guy who's not one of the good old boys. He's kind of the pretty boy. And so the drama, the tension, the personalities, like, who are the really, really big dynamic? Like, Jeff Gordon broke through. People knew who he was outside of NASCAR. Same thing with Dale Earnhardt, obviously with Dale Earnhardt Jr. Is there that guy today? Jimmy Johnson was probably the last one.
But he was boring. That's the thing. The knock on him was that he was boring.
He just won.
What's interesting is, so Kyle Larson is a superstar, and he can run any type of car, but he's not a big name. Denny Hamlin is a superstar, never won a championship. You can make the case that the most interesting people in NASCAR are the owners. Case in point, so you got Michael Jordan. Michael Jordan right now is suing NASCAR. Here's the biggest story. The biggest story of this past week, it happened yesterday, is Dale Earnhardt Jr. is fielding his first ever NASCAR Cup car, and he's partnering with Chris Stapleton. So Chris Stapleton, Travelers Whiskey, is going to be on the car, and they're not even guaranteed a spot. The driver is Justin Allgaier, so they have to qualify. Now they're probably going to, because they're gonna make sure they get that car into the Daytona 500. This is a one race deal, but it is kind of interesting. The biggest superstar in NASCAR is still Dale Earnhardt Jr. And he's about 49 or 50 years old. He hasn't really run a cup race in however many years. He'll run about one Xfinity race every year. But this is a good thing and a bad thing. The fact that the highest selling diecast, NASCAR is obsessed with those diecast cars. People collect them. The top selling one last year was not a NASCAR. It was Dale Earnhardt Jr. brought back the Budweiser Red 8 paint scheme for a late model race at a small track. But that was such a big seller. That was a bigger seller than every other NASCAR, which is great for Dale Earnhardt Jr., but it also says a lot about the sport that somebody who's 50 years old hasn't really been really involved in whatever it is, 8-10 years. That's the top selling car. That tells you two things. NASCAR lacks superstars, but also Dale Earnhardt Jr. is just one of these larger than life figures also.
Yeah. And I mean, if I was looking at it from an outsider perspective, which I am because I'm not a fan, like, I'm thinking, okay, what would I do to change the sport? Part of it is, as I said, you need the names. Like, for instance, one advantage that NASCAR has over something like baseball or especially football or basketball is guys can have longer careers. It's kind of like golf in that respect. Like, you can golf and be pretty good and even contend for a major in your 40s. Unless you're LeBron James, you can't do that in the NBA or pretty much any other sport. But in NASCAR, like, for instance, Dale Earnhardt Jr., correct me if I'm wrong, he didn't retire just because he couldn't do it. Like, it wasn't because he got too old, right? He just kind of walked away. Like, Jimmy Johnson was still really good when he left too, right? Jeff Gordon was still pretty good when he left. So my point is, some of this is you have that advantage of having guys who not only can still do it, but can still compete at a fairly high level as they get older. It would be nice if they stuck around for a while, right? Like, why couldn't Dale Earnhardt Jr. have had a 30-year career? Why couldn't Jeff Gordon have had a 35-year career?
So it's interesting, some of the names you mentioned. So look, Dale Earnhardt Sr. obviously passes away. I think he was right around 50. But Dale Earnhardt Jr. had concussion issues. And that's one of the reasons that he walked away, which also, I think, started when you have a superstar like that has to walk away because of concussions. And then, obviously, you can have way worse outcomes than even a concussion. Just look at his dad. But I do think somebody like Carl Edwards, who's from Columbia, Missouri. Now, he was kind of pissed at NASCAR, but he retired. I think he's my age, maybe your age. I think he's 44, 45. He retired about 8 years ago. So I do think you're seeing guys, they want to keep their health intact and their brains intact, and they made a hell of a lot of money. That's the difference. The NASCAR drivers nowadays actually aren't making as much money as the guys who were driving 10, 15, 20 years ago, which is crazy. That's a big story in NASCAR. What other sport are the athletes making less now? NASCAR might be the only sport. You're seeing quarterbacks make $50 million a year. NASCAR drivers are actually making less than they did 10 years ago.
Yeah, and look, I can't blame their individual decisions. I want to be clear, I would do the same thing. Like, that's a crazy sport. Yeah, as you say, I know the technology since Earnhardt Jr. has improved or Earnhardt Sr. has improved dramatically. So I know that it's less likely something like that happens now, but the fact that it's even in play,
Mm-hmm.
I can totally understand why people would make that individual decision. But for the sport, it's not a good thing because you're losing these names and you're not replacing them with other names. That's what draws in the casual fan. The only other thing I can think of, and I think this is true with all sports, is the attention span issue. This affects every sport. It's why baseball made really dramatic rule changes to speed up their games over the last few years. Things that wouldn't have even been possible. Like, no one would have agreed to a pitch clock 30 years ago. But they did, because we realized that people's attention spans are so much shorter than they used to be. So when I look at a NASCAR race, what are we doing? We're doing, I know they're different, right? But it's like a lot of them are 200 or 250 laps, right?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, Daytona 500, 500 miles. So you're talking about going around the track in most of these races a couple of 100 times. These are 4 or 5 hour events. And then if there are cautions, they drive around the track and it takes forever to start again. And sometimes the race ends like that. I mean, it's just, so what would I do? I would shorten the races. I would do events. I know that, like, the playoff thing was great. I think that they did, because that made it so that you knew, okay, here's how you qualify. And then each week, a certain number of drivers are eliminated. So you go from, like, 16 to 12 to 8 and to 4. And so now there are real stakes and you're building towards something. I think that's great. I think leagues need more events like the NBA Cup is doing. Have events during the season. So it's like in NASCAR, the Daytona 500 is a huge event that draws in the casual fan. And then there's really nothing else like that until the playoff. And now part of that is because the Daytona 500 has that history. But maybe you could do something where you had different kinds of races. I know they do, obviously, road courses, but I'm talking about, like, different formats. Like, okay, this is going to be a race that's 25 laps, just balls to the wall for an hour. And that's this race. And, and like, so that people know, okay, I'm not investing 5 hours of my Sunday to watch the race. I've got a 1 hour race. They're going to go like hell, and they're not going to end it under caution. They're going to end it racing, like rubbing some paint, baby. That I might watch. That might get somebody like me to tune in if I know, instead of having to sit there and watch them drive around the track for 5 hours, they're going to be racing hard for, 20 laps.
So here's where I do think you need to watch the end of some races, because NASCAR has made some changes where they have this green-white checkered. Now, some people say it's actually too gimmicky, but at the end, if they have a caution, they will basically re-rack the field and they'll go balls to the wall. And what usually happens is a caution will breed another caution. Now, technically, you can still have a race end under caution if the leader on the last lap, right? If you've gone the first lap of they call it overtime. If you've gone the first lap, if that leader is then, if there's a caution on the final lap, technically that guy wins. But they've created this overtime, which I like. I think it's great for casual fans. The old school fan doesn't like it because it does become gimmicky. It becomes a wreck fest, but it's pretty damn entertaining if you're just, I know you say you don't flip around, but if you are flipping around, it is pretty cool for the casual fan.
Yeah. I just think all sports, like, sports leagues can't just, and that's why I think baseball was really smart to do what they did. And it's helped them. Their ratings were up this year. Now, part of that was they had the Dodgers and the Yankees in the World Series, but the game times are way down. They got the result they were looking for, which is, what do people want? People want more action. It's like we talked about why we doom scroll social media. We don't want to watch commercials anymore. We don't watch commercials anymore. We get what we want when we want it. And we want action. We don't want 1,000 timeouts at the end of an NBA game and the last 5 minutes takes 45 minutes. We want to see the action. And I think that's part of the issue with NASCAR is there is good action in NASCAR. I've seen some exciting finishes, but there's also a lot of, okay, we're on lap 186 of, 250, and here comes another caution, And now we'll drive around the track for 25 minutes till everybody gets good and they clean up, the wreck. And look, some of that's going to happen no matter what, right? They're driving 200 miles an hour. But I'm just saying, whatever they can do to speed up the pace and bring the action, I think would make it more interesting. I would mess with the formats of the races in terms of the length. I would do I know they've done some of those stage things, right? Where they race for a certain number of laps. And so one person will win that stage and then they'll race for another amount of laps. That I think is good. Anything you can do that can give people more of the action and less of the delay, I think would help any sport.
See, I agree with you. And the old school NASCAR fans that see this, they're going to disagree with both of us. They don't like the stage racing. I do, but it's all good. Different people like different things. Eric, great show, buddy. I think we should do a weekly, just a NASCAR hit. And I'm serious. I'm not just doing this because we have a NASCAR audience that will like this, but also I think Eric, as the casual sports fan, how we get Eric into NASCAR, I think we should try this weekly.
Okay.
All right.
Maybe I will. You tell me when the race is, and tell me when the exciting part will be. Like what time I can watch the last 10 laps, and I will try to do that. I'll give you a report back.
All right. See you, buddy. Take it easy, everybody.